Okay, excellent. So let's get started. Let's get started with today's lecture. Today what I want to talk to you about social networks. But before we do so, just one quick announcement. Just that you remember, because I need to remember these kind of things, because otherwise I would have shown up here, So I figured out next week it's Easter break. So no lecture on Friday next week. Okay, let's talk about social networks and where do networks fit into this whole lecture and so on. Well, we talked a lot about, like social influence. Yeah? We had a whole lecture on social influence. Then the last time I talked to you about crime spreading. Yeah? Again, it's sort of like, this is now a form of influence. I just showed you in that case that crime can be contagious. Let's say if one norm is being broken, then something else happens. Or if you see somebody else breaking a norm, then you're more likely to do it, and so on. Yeah. So there we now showed that interdependencies matter. Yeah, and we also walked through that in terms of macro level outcomes. We looked at segregation in that context. There is, individuals, they interact with the people around them. And then we looked at what are the macro level implications of that. And then we kind of had this very weird thing that we can have individuals that actually are very tolerant. They would be happy to live in neighborhoods with lots of other people who are different from themselves. But we still have, if that is sort of the rule for individual behavior, we still end up having these cascades, these chain reactions where ultimately we have a large amount of segregation, even though nobody wants it. Yeah? So that's sort of like very, very odd. But maybe now you understand where networks come into play. Because networks, it's ultimately, you'll see in a second what I mean with networks. It's not like social networking sites, although they are very important in that context too, but social networks are much more general. It's really about, like a picture that you see here, like a graph, like interdependencies, and we can look at all sorts of interdependencies, and I brought a whole bunch of examples with me. You can look at criminal networks, who co-offends with whom. You can look at bullying networks. Actually, I'm about to start a research project on this, about not who is friends with whom, but who hates whom. Yeah? So again, you can represent that. This is relational data. And when you think about the segregation context there, what were our relations in the segregation context? Well, it was just a neighborhood where people live. They interact with the people around them. And then they are affected by the people around them. When they do something, then they go somewhere else. So networks is just a more generalized way of kind of thinking about the structure of interdependencies. And while networks are sort of interesting by itself, I think they are just sort of cool, and there's a huge research community that looks at social networks. But there's also a reason for us. Like there's an epistemological reason for us why we think about networks. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit now. Yeah. So when I talk about interdependencies. Okay, so what do we mean with interdependencies? Basically, like the one thing affects the other. Yeah, it's not, they are dependent on each other. It's not that I do something and nobody else is affected by it. Interdependencies means that something changes something else for somebody else. Yeah. So that's with the idea with interdependencies. And when you think about what we try to do in analytical sociology, we really try to, there's even this mechanistic idea, social mechanisms, like really go to or there's another expression used by Jon Elster, famous sociologist at Columbia. He talks about the cogs and wheels, like what are the things that kind of rotate, what are the things, how does the society work, how do things interact with each other, and then what are the implications of it, and so on. Yeah? And one task of us as sociologists is to really dig in, and really take these things apart. And actually one of the the biggest book in analytical sociology, written by my former PhD advisor, by Peter Hedstrom, it's called Dissecting the Social, cutting apart the social. Really taking things apart, looking at the individual elements of it in a way. And this is sort of what we're doing. We're really taking things apart. We really want to see how does this thing work. Yeah? And then you go there and you look at those things, and you even want to know how do they rotate. What are the things, how do they run. Yeah? But maybe now you're maybe now you kind of understand that just taking things apart, just looking at how things run by themselves, that's not enough. That's not enough. Why is it not enough? Well, because those things are related with each other. Yeah? So now I'm talking about this in a very abstract sense, yeah? But we'll come down to specific networks. The different parts of society, they are related with each other. That's what the hell this whole lecture is all about. You know? I tell you about segregation and the one person moving and then having an effect on somebody else, or I talked about how things how innovations diffuse through a society. Yeah? We had the Coleman's medical innovation study, or we talk about how success breeds success. You know, like one thing leads to the other. The whole idea is that there are these interdependencies. And for me, this is sort of the very, very core of sociological thinking, that things are related with each other. And that means we really need to think about how they are related with each other, because if we don't look at those relationships, you might get a wrong idea about how those different components interact with each other, yeah? Which then ultimately might lead to a very different macro level outcome. So it's not just about taking things apart. Of course, that's kind of like the first step. So you, as a social scientist, you really want to take things apart, but then you also want to think about how do those components interact with each other. Yeah. And the reason for that is because of the macro level outcomes that we are ultimately interested in. Yeah. Okay, so this is sort of where we are. So we can think of all those different components, and they are all, now you see how many different components are related with each other. Yeah? And now this is still in a very abstract, but maybe now it becomes a little clearer, because what if those components are individuals? And then this is now a social network. This is sort of, you'll see lots of plots like this, where you have sort of dots, or we call them actors, or vertices, or nodes. You know, these are just different names for the little individuals, and then they are related with each other. And that relation can be all sorts of things. You know, it can be a love relationship, it can be a friendship relationship, it can be an advice relationship, it can be a hate relationship, yeah? It can be a bullying relationship. But they are related with each other somehow. So this is sort of my nutshell view about, we have the Coleman boat. You know, we want to understand macro level outcomes, but I think in order to understand these macro level outcomes, we really need to think about what is the structure, how individuals interact with each other, right? Because if you buy into that idea, and I hope that you buy by now into that idea, that macro outcome we need is the results of micro level dynamics. Now we have micro level behaviors, and people influence each other, and that kind of leads to broader macro level outcomes. And that's the whole reason why we separate the macro from the micro level. You know, ultimately we want to understand the relationships between macro phenomena, but we need to think about the individuals that are involved in them. Yeah? And here I'm making that point, and finally I'm just supposed to write a book chapter about this, where I'm making this point that in order to seriously take the individuals into account, to understand this process going from the macro to the micro and then up to the macro again, we need to have social networks at the very center of this. Yeah? So we call this James Coleman's boat, because it looks a bit like boat. James Coleman, the guy who had this idea about this schema, you know. So I'm saying basically in order for this boat to sail, we need to have social networks at the very core of it. That's the structure. That's the structure on which individuals interact with each other, on which these social dynamics unfold. Yeah? So we need to think about the structure, how people are related with each other, and how maybe they affect this person but not another one, right? And then maybe you see that that different structures might lead to different macro level outcomes, given the same individual level roles. Yeah? If you have a structure where everybody looks at everybody, yeah, everybody sees immediately when somebody is unhappy or has a certain opinion and so on. But when you have network structure, and that's actually what we observe, that are separated in a way, you know, that you're friends with people who are all friends amongst each other, and then there's a whole other part of the society, and they are friends with each other, but there are not that many links between you in a way, then you can see how certain opinions can then get reinforced and live through your part of the network, but it never reaches the other part of the network. Yeah? like in a similar way, you know, like when you have an amplification of opinions or of beliefs, and actually that's what we observe. That's what we observe in the real world. We have, I don't know, people in the States, Democrats, most of their friends are Democrats. We have Republicans, most of their friends are Republicans. And then they kind of talk with each other, and then they only talk amongst each other, because this is sort of what their network structures are. So network structures is sort of like a more abstract way, but at the same time also more fine-grained to get about who listens to whom. And then who is affected by whom. Instead of just saying that Republicans only listen to Republicans and Democrats only listen to Democrats, we can have this in a more refined way now. And we can actually go out and look at the data, like who is friends with whom. And then how would those dynamics unfold on different network structures. And that's actually quite a bit of interesting literature on these kind of things. Like how do things like segregation evolve when we have different network structures? How do things like opinion polarization evolve when we have different network structures? And often we have very interesting and counterintuitive results with these kind of things, or where the network structure really matters. And this is something where, again, I don't know, if somebody asks you, so what is your point as a sociologist? I think this is a good point as a sociologist, because in different situations, let's say different network structures, the individual is exactly the same. So the psychology of the individual is exactly the same. There's still the same rules, it's still the same person, whatnot. But because this individual might be embedded in different networks, or in different parts of the network, or if then the network looks different and so on, if everybody's connected to everybody, or if it's like a separated network and so on, you can have completely different outcomes. So you have exactly the same individuals, but what is sort of driving the outcome is how those individuals are related with each other. And when they are related with each other in different ways, you can get different outcomes. So that's something that individuals might not be aware of, or they don't even see it. How do you see the big network? You hardly ever see that. Although, I don't know if I have an example of this, but there are these funny, sometimes there are these tools, I don't know, I think I came across a Facebook tool at some point. You can basically install it, and then it kind of maps out your friendship network and shows you who is friends with whom amongst your friends as well. But normally you're not really aware of these kind of things. I don't have the eagle's eyes view on my social network in which I'm embedded in. Maybe I know the people that I'm friends with. Maybe I know about a few of them that they are friends with each other in a way, because we tend to hang out as a group. So I know they are friends with each other too. But then I don't see them when I'm not there. This is sort of where structure matters. Okay, but what do I have here? Well, I'm going back to this original definition that we had in one of the very first lectures about what analytical sociology is. And saying, okay, it's a sociological perspective that seeks to systematically formulate and empirically test micro-funded mechanism-based explanations of complex macro-level patterns and dynamics. The idea is social life is inherently dynamic and interdependent. Things depend on each other. It's not that individuals live in isolation from each other. And because of that, we emphasize in analytical sociology the importance of interaction. That's sort of like the whole point that I'm making here right now. And now here, as you see one of the first network plots that I have here, you'll see more of it later on. But basically the idea is, dependencies are crucial, and we know that dependencies are crucial. Well, I've shown you a bunch of examples. I've showed you now that crime is contagious. I've shown you now that innovation spreads through networks, through people who they know. And I could show you lots of other studies as well that show that smoking behavior is contagious, or that divorce is contagious, or that suicide is contagious. So we need to think about these interdependencies. They matter. This is how our world works. Okay, so now let me talk about social networks and introduce that. So it's going to be a little bit technical, but I just want to set the scene, and next week we'll continue talking about that. And next week I want to show you why your friends tend to have more friends than you, why your friends tend to be better looking than you, which is another little fun project that I've been working on. It's pure logic, but in order to get there, I want to talk a little more about networks in general. And networks, it's something that we have other courses here at UCD. I think there's a third-year course on social networks taught by a colleague of mine, Pablo Lucas, and I'm teaching these things at the master's level. And And then all my PhD students work in this area as well. Okay, let's talk about social networks. What are social networks? Well, you might think about these kind of things. Yeah. You're all on it. I don't know. We can't avoid it. Is anybody not on any of these? Not really. This is just how life goes nowadays. Had an interesting discussion with a psychologist who gave a talk here at UCD on Wednesday. She was looking at how the online world and being embedded in the online world changes our psyche and our criminal behavior and whatnot and these kind of things. It's actually scary what she had to say, but I think this is just how the world works nowadays. But when we talk about social networks in an academic context, well, we study these things too. So actually I study Facebook too, or I study Twitter too, or actually one of my PhD students looks at Twitter data right now. It's fascinating. It's sort of like it's a completely new way of doing social science research. Why? Because nowadays we leave traces behind like hell. It's actually really scary what we now know about people, all the data that we have. It's like a huge tsunami hitting us. And this is hitting not just us as sociologists, but this is hitting the whole society. It's transforming the way police departments work. It's online crime. It's crazy. It's transforming the way children evolve. Nowadays, they sit in you have little toddlers and they are on the tablet and they play around with things. It completely changes. It probably already changed your life in ways that you are not even aware of. So it's completely transforming our society, and it's going really, really deep, and we are all connected all the time. We check things all the time, and so on. It's a huge challenge for sociologists, for social science, but also a huge opportunity for us to do research that couldn't be done before. Before, we just didn't have the data. Before, I had to go out and do a survey. Now I can scrape live feeds of Twitter accounts. I see exactly what's happening. I see exactly what people tweet about, what they care about. What I can apply algorithms on it to identify which kind of mood are they, what it's the topic that they are talking about. It's a completely different way how we do social sciences. But when we talk about social networks, that's actually what we mean. It's about relational data. Oftentimes it's about individuals sometimes being friends with each other. That's sort of where this research originally came from. And a lot of research is still conducted in school classes. You go and have actually colleagues that done these kind of surveys, and I work with that kind of data as well, where they go into school classes and then they have everybody gets a list with all the people in the school, or everybody in the school class, and then they kind of tick a box, who am I friends with? Or another way, they're kind of given the opportunity to name their 5 best friends in the school class. And then they write down their names. And that's relational data, because then now it's made very explicit. There's a relation from the one to the other. So this is sort of what we mean when we talk about social networks. And social networks, as I said, they can be very, very broad. And kind of it's an abstract concept. Well, as I said, it's not necessarily about friendship. It can be about kinship relationship, who is related with whom. It can be about romantic relationships. It can be about bullying relationships. These are all social networks. It can also be now at a different level. It can be about political alliances of countries. So now, instead of having individuals being your unit of analysis, like the little figures, like the little dots, now you would have a dot for each country. And there's a line between the two countries when, let's say, there's a trade agreement between those two countries. Or then you could even think about what is the amount of trade flowing from the one direction to the other. It can be about markets, flow of goods, supply chains, labor markets. It can be about teams or interlocking directorates. You can have companies, and you have like the directorate of a company, and oftentimes or the advisory board, some people sit in different advisory boards, and then you can say, okay, well, if this guy is at this company at the advisory board and at this other company in the advisory board, whenever he's working with that company, he surely knows about this other company as well. Yeah? And then this would be like interlocking directorates, where the unit of analysis would be companies, and they are linked with each other when directors sit on the board. Email exchange between individuals. Yeah. So you can be very creative in this. What are the relations that are relevant here in your context? But it's not necessarily about just social networks. Networks are even more universal. You can look at food webs. Biologists do that, or evolutionary biologists. They look at who eats whom in the animal world. Or the internet is a network. Yeah? But now you don't have the individuals being the nodes, but a computer, or a server, or the power grid, or the airline networks. And your airline networks would be, okay, now the nodes are cities or the airports, and they are there's a line from one airport to the other when there's a direct flight. And then you can actually use that data, and one of my former bosses in Switzerland, he wrote a paper which was published, when was it, 2012 or so, it was published in Science, about how then diseases spread. Because you could think, okay, hang on, airports actually matter. Like people travel around, there's a virus in your country, how does it spread? Well, the airports are the transportation hubs here, right? And then the network of between the airports or transportation networks, they matter greatly for how those viruses are likely to diffuse, how they're going to spread and how they're going to reach out. Neural networks, economic networks, so basically networks are just very universal. It's not just social networks, but there's a wider discipline behind that as well, and other folks look at it too. But you can start looking at networks between people. By the way, I'm on this graph somewhere. That's one of those geeky things that research groups sometimes do. This was my research group back in England, where I was at Nuffield College, and we all studied networks, and it was basically the birthday of my boss, and that's sort of ultimately what he got as a present. But this is now a network from a study that I had published a few years back. This is now a network about the art market, the international art market. When you look at the dots, we call them nodes. You see Art Cologne, Art Chicago, or Toronto Art Fair, or whatever. There's some other important ones. Art Basel. These are shows where this is sort of how the art market works. I didn't know about this before either. Like with artists nowadays, they are represented by galleries. It's like they are their agents, sort of. And then these galleries, they go to these fairs and showcase their artists. They want to sell them there. And these are the famous places to go. So when you are in the art world, you know about Art Cologne and Art Basel and so on, because these are the places to be, where all those galleries are being on display, and where all those artists then are being presented. And what we did in this case, we thought, okay, well, hang on, we had information about all those art fairs over actually a long period of time, over a couple of years. And we thought, okay, how does this art market work? What is the structure underlying this? And then we constructed basically a link between two art fairs when there were a certain amount of galleries that participated in both art fairs. So that shows us, okay, there's one gallery that has a stand at this art fair and at that art fair. And that kind of creates the link between the two things. And then we basically we try to understand what is driving this market. And then we look at things like, geographic distance. We also look at similarity in terms of the kinds of artists that they present. And you can do all sorts of things with it. I have another example here. This is a network that I've been working on quite a bit, so I had 2 papers published on this. This is a youth gang in London. So a youth gang in London, a friend of mine, James Densley, he actually embedded himself in a youth gang for 2 years. He did an ethnography with that. It was quite a violent youth gang. They did all sorts of crime. But at the same time, he also worked together with the police. And what the police did, they actually, they had surveillance on that youth gang. Yeah, actually, they even had a secret agent embedded in that youth gang as well. Yeah. And then with that police information, we constructed the network about who is co-offending with whom. So now here, the dots stand for different individuals, and a link between two individuals means that they robbed something together, or they stole something together, or they did a drug deal together and got arrested for it. Yeah? So it kind of tells us about who is co-offending with whom. It's not just that individuals commit crime by themselves, but they do it in networks. They do it together with other people. Yeah? And then in this case, the substantive question that we had was related to the ethnicity of those guys. Now you see the 4 different colors. Actually they were all black, so it was an all black youth gang, but it was one youth gang, but there were different subgroups within it. Some folks, they came from East Africa, other ones came from the Caribbean, other ones came from West Africa, and so on. And what we looked at, substantively, we first looked at what kinds of crime do those guys commit, and we found there's no difference for different ethnic groups. So everybody seems to do everything: drug deals, violent crimes, robberies. At least there's no significant difference here. But then we looked at the network, and then we found that actually ethnicity matters greatly. So ethnicity does not matter for what kinds of crime that those guys do, but it matters for with whom they do it. Yeah. And these are the kind of questions that you have when you study social networks. So in this case, we looked at homophily, and we wrote 2 papers about that. Homophily basically means that there are more ties more likely between 2 individuals who are similar. And that's a very prevalent finding that we have in the real world. Okay, let me show you another example, which is actually part of my PhD. So actually, I studied Manchester United as part of my PhD, and I looked at the passing network. Who passes the ball to whom in a football match? So now the nodes are individual players, and now you see those arrows, and some arrows are thicker than others, or some lines are thicker than others. Now, the thickness of those lines stands for how many times do they pass the ball from the one guy to the other. And then I looked at the structure of this, because ultimately I was interested in what makes a good team. And this idea that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So I wanted to know what makes a good team. And you can calculate now the structure. You can look at various different things of this structure, and what I looked at was centralization. So how unequally distributed are things? Is there like a superstar? You should actually see that in the passing network, in the kinds of interaction. Is there one person where everything goes through? Or is it that everybody seems to make equal amounts of passes to everybody else in a way? So these are the kind of stuff that you then calculate in network analysis. And then you relate it substantively. In this case, I related it with the performance of the team. And I found that at the end, teams that play in a decentralized way, where there's an equal passing amongst each other, they tend to be better. But I could actually show this. I could actually show this with hard data and with statistical analysis. So that was one of the things. Actually, I had another paper which is actually published by now, so it's not in press anymore, it's published. Got out last year. What I'm doing here, I combined that data about the passes. So I had lots of data. It was funny. It was almost like looking at the matrix, because there's a football matches like with thousands of events of what actually happens on the pitch, and I had hundreds of those football matches to look at, and I could really see, like in the movie The Matrix, how the football match unfolds, with the different codes and stuff like that. And what I did here I actually combined that data about the passing, which is what you see now here on the right-hand side. On the right-hand side, it's again like a passing network now for Arsenal. On the left-hand side, I created, with some other data that I collected, about individual career trajectories. So there I looked at how long do players know each other. When we were in the same youth team, we know each other. And when we played for longer in the same team, when we played for, Dublin for a few years, we know each other. And then we meet again in Maynooth or where else, then it makes sense that now I remember how you play, right? And that's the idea that I had here. Here I wanted to know, do individuals, is there a relationship between how individuals interact on the pitch and how well they know each other? Well, actually I could show there is, but you need to show these kind of things first, because there is a literature out there that says that when you have a team and individuals know each other better in that team, you give them more time, they will be better. But how does it work? Well, actually here I kind of had a way of kind of showing how it works, because knowing each other translates into how we interact with each other, because then we can coordinate our actions. If I know you for a while, if I've played with you in the same team for a while, I know where you're going to run. I can pass you the ball in a better way than if I don't know you. And you have that in all sorts of teams. When you know the people more, you know more how they behave. You can anticipate their behavior, and then you can change your interaction towards them. And then I related these two things with each other and found a relationship. I'm running late here, but let me talk about this anyway, because, actually I might talk more about this at some point, one of the last lectures. This was a study that I did, or a paper that we wrote, about a corruption scandal. So this is a corruption scandal, but then afterwards people were kind of put on trial, and they started to point fingers at each other. So what you see is like the red individual is the individual that is now at this particular moment in time in front of the trial of the judge. And then this guy points fingers at others and says, well, this other guy was involved, or this guy was involved. You see, it's now a negative relationship. It's not about friendship or so on, but it's a negative relationship. And what we do, we actually study the dynamics of this. So how does this unfold? And ultimately what we do find, but I will talk more about that in another session, we find network effects. We find things like, if you denounce me, I'm more likely to denounce you. We find evidence for scapegoating. People bang up on somebody. And we find evidence for collective punishment. So if somebody talks too much, the person gets punished collectively by others. But that's sort of like, basically now maybe you get a feeling for what we call the network paradigm. A network paradigm is that not just the composition of elements of a system matter, but also how these elements are arranged and related with each other. And then the next step, an individual's positions in the network matters. Or it can be an advantage. And ultimately, we call it the unit of analysis. The unit of analysis is what's sort of like the smallest unit that we are sort of interested in here. And oftentimes these are individuals. Unless you do, let's say, a study on countries, then your unit of analysis is a country. Or if you look at companies, then your unit of analysis is a company. For us, here the unit of analysis is the diet, and with the diet we mean the relationship between, or the potential relationship between two individuals. Well, I could talk a little bit, because now these things are a little formalized, but let's not forget about this. At the end, a network is simply defined as a set of what we call vertices, sort of individuals 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. That's sort of like V. And the second one is a set of edges. Edges is basically the relationships between them. And if you would look a little closer in what do these E stand for, it means it's a subset of Ij, where Ij are element of V. So basically, it's like a list of relationships that we have. And then we can represent a network in an adjacency matrix. I quickly show you this in an example. You see now a network here on the right-hand side. It's a simple network, and the way we would deal with that information with that network is as this matrix. This matrix on the network on the left and the matrix on the right-hand side is just a representation of the picture that you see on the left. How does that work? Well, there you see now in the picture you see there is a tie. This is what we call a tie. There's a link from node number 3 to node number 1. And it's being represented by a 1 in this matrix, at the third row of the first column. So the row is the sender, and the column is the receiver of a tie. And that's sort of how we deal with networks. And then at the end, there's a lot of, calculations that we do with these matrices, ultimately. So actually, matrix algebra is extremely useful if you want to study networks here. But let me move on, because I don't want to listen so much time here. So what is network analysis then? Network analysis can be a simple description of these little plots, or of the underlying matrix, right? But then we can also calculate individual level stuff, and that's sort of like the stuff that I want to get to now a little bit. We can calculate something like centrality or importance in a network. We can visualize it, we can do statistical modeling of it and whatnot, So we can calculate distances between things, but I don't want to, let me jump over that. Maybe I'll talk about that the next time a little bit. But I want to get to centrality. Centrality is basically this idea that some individuals are important in the network. Well-connected actors, and actually there's a whole literature that well-connected actors are in a structurally advantageous position. They get better jobs, they get better information, their network position matters. You heard that before, your networks matter. Actually, they do. They do matter for getting jobs and things like that. There are studies that show exactly this kind of thing. But how do you now distinguish different network positions from each other? And what is well connected? What is well connected? Yeah? I had a little exercise, but we don't have time for that, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Because what would it mean being important in a network? Yeah? And now there are different ways of how you can think about what well connected is. Maybe the simplest one that you might think about, or if I would have given you time for the little exercise, probably that's the one that you would have come up with. A well-connected person just has lots of friends, right? Isn't that straightforward? Yes, actually, that's very straightforward, and that's the simplest measure of centrality. But I show you there are actually lots of other ones. So we could simply count how many friends individuals have. Somebody has lots of friends, somebody else has less friends. You'd say the person with lots of friends is more important than the person with less friends. You could argue that. You could calculate incoming and outcoming ties. It's just a complication of things. But you have a little network here, and now you have just 5 little nodes, and you could see the degree centrality score of individual A would be 4 because he has 4 friends. Well, all the other ones only have 1 friend. So that's degree centrality, and then we can look at how these things are distributed and so on and whatnot. But hang on a moment. Maybe that doesn't capture everything. What about being close to other ones? What about being so located that you can send messages to everybody very quickly? Maybe that's what defines importance in a network. Yeah? So that you are quick in sending information to everybody else, to get something diffused through the network. And that's actually slightly different. Actually, this is what we would call closeness centrality. Closeness centrality, again, don't worry about the math too much. Yeah? Closeness centrality is basically just a measure for how many steps does it take on average for an individual to reach everybody else. And a step through a network is going from one link to the other and then walking somewhere else and walking somewhere else. Yeah? But there's a last between centrality that I want to briefly just give you the intuition for. That's what we call between centrality. Because it might be that I don't have many friends, but maybe I have just the right friends, and everybody else needs to go through me to connect themselves with each other. So now I am a person who's like a mediator. And I might have only 2 friends, but I'm connecting people over here and people over there. And if those guys want to send messages to those guys over there, they need to send it through me. So I'm now sort of like the gatekeeper. Or I'm sort of like the mediator. And you see that now this definition of importance or centrality doesn't necessarily imply that I have lots of friends. I could be very low on degree centrality, but I could be high on betweenness centrality. Okay, so these are sort of some measures for centrality or importance in networks, and I'm going to follow up on these kind of things. But if you want to know more about that stuff, actually I'm just preparing a book right now on how to do this kind of analysis, but it's a little further down the road. But read this article, Why Your Friends Have More Friends Than You Do. It's not just very simple to read, but it's also very interesting and fascinating read. And besides the fact, it's relevant for the exam as well. Yeah? Okay, so I see you guys again on Tuesday.